Hello, my name is Bruce Wayne, and welcome to another one of my adventures. So when I lived with Auntie Barbara, there's a number of things that I learned. One of them is I remember Auntie Barbara sitting me down one day and telling me that she's going to teach me how to cook, to be a better cook. I'd already cooked some, but that was basically survival cooking. She was going to show me how to cook properly. And I remember in one particular meal that she actually taught me how to cook, which was curry chicken. And I remember her very attentively sitting there teaching me how to cook. I also remembered that, on a sidebar note about Auntie Barbara had this superpower. If, in the cupboard, there could be cups that's been sitting in the cupboards for years that she's never used. But for whatever reason, if you broke that cup, Auntie Barbara always knew that you broke that cup. She would go in the cupboard and she'd go, "What happened to so-and-so cup?" I don't know how she does it, but it was pretty magical that she always figured out whenever we broke something. And also the difference in Jamaica at the time is if you broke a plate or a cup, etc., you were in trouble. You were in really big trouble and you might get a beating. Like if Uncle Clive was home, he'd beat you because you broke a cup. So that's something that you did not want to do. Now, I remember also, she taught me 3 things in particular. She said, "I'm going to teach you how to cook, how to sew, how to wash your own clothes correctly using a washing machine as opposed to hand washing." And I actually learned all 3. And the reason why she taught me that, she told me that this is so that you'll never have to depend on a woman. Now, it may seem sexist, but I think it was a way of being independent. I find it fascinating that years later, many of the women that I actually dated, I actually taught them how to cook because they could cook or they weren't as good at cook, etc. So that came in handy. Now, one of the things that would happen each summer, it happened maybe about 2 or 3 summers, Auntie Barbara would send me to live with my uncle, Uncle Geddes. Geddes is a famous name in Jamaica. And Uncle Geddes was actually, his real name was Sammy Heslop, Heslop. And they called him, he was a jockey. He was very short, and he was a jockey, and they called him Shuffler. Shuffler was his nickname that they called him as a jockey. Now, my uncle was a very, very famous jockey in Jamaica. He was so famous, he actually has a legendary story where he rode a horse that was called Long Shot. And he rode Long Shot, which apparently had a pretty long shot of winning, and he won the race. And after he won the race, the horse fell, and I guess the horse must have died, but my uncle actually broke both of his legs at the time. And so it was a very, very famous story. And my uncle eventually became president of the jockey club in Jamaica. And at the time, there were only basically 2 major sports that was in Jamaica. There's actually 3. It was track and field, and then there's cricket, but then there was also horse racing. And horse racing was really a big deal. And we lived very close to the race course, which is where the horse raced. My uncle actually did. And so each summer I would go to spend time with my uncle at his stable, where he had all the horses there. And part of our job, and I remember my cousin and I, and my brother eventually, Michael and I, we would spend time with my uncle there, and he would give us work, tasks that he wanted us to do. And one of the things I was sidebar, my uncle had this dog, and his name was Rusty. And my uncle smoked a bong as well too, like serious weed. And when he smoked, I remember, like I told you before, that there was like a big plume of smoke, and you could hardly see his head when he smoked it with his other brother, my other uncle. but he also blew the smoke into Rusty's eyes and his face as well. So you had this dog, and it was a little mutt dog, but this dog was, I don't know what it did to him, and I don't know whether or not biologically there is any evidence to substantiate this, but I knew that the dog was extremely aggressive. And you could just go to the dog, and we lived close to the cane field, and Rusty had a number of other little minions, little smaller dogs that he actually was kind of the ringleader of, the alpha dog. And so I remember my uncle, they would just go choo, 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 hug, hug. And it basically what that meant was there was a wild pig running around in the cane field, and Rusty and his little gang of dogs would run out there, chase after the pig, try to kill the pig. We were, my brother Michael and I and my other cousin Kamal, we were terrified of Rusty because this dog seemed unpredictable with his little gang of dogs. So we were responsible for cleaning out the stable, when my uncle, gave us tasks to do. And so sometimes my uncle would finish our task, and my uncle would leave us for the day to go off to work. And the minute my uncle would leave for work, the first thing, we would sometimes sit on top of these big giant boxes. This is where you store the hay for the horses, and so they were huge. And so my cousin and I, Kamal, would climb up on top of the box, and we would sit up there for like sometimes hours because Rusty would be walking around, and we were terrified that this dog was going to kill us like he was chasing those pigs out there. And so Rusty would occasionally wander into one of the empty stables, and the minute he did that, we would lock him in there, and then we could go out and play. And so my uncle would come home. I remember him saying to us, he's like, who keeps locking the dog in the stable? And we would go, oh, it must be one of the apprentices that is doing it. We don't know anything about it. But of course, we were absolutely guilty, of locking the dog in there. And so I also remember that we used to take the horses down to the racetrack. So, they didn't, at the time, he was very close to the racetrack, which we call the race course. And so he didn't put them in a carriage and drive them to that location. He was so close by, within maybe about a couple of miles, that he was able to, we just walked the horse along the highway, not the highway, but just the street all the way to the race course. And I would remember the closer the horse would get to the race course, the more excited the horse would get. It's almost like he could smell the dirt or the track from there, but he would start getting, very animated. And of course, we were always terrified to make sure that we kept the horses in check, before their race. And also, I remember us going out where he would give us, we would have to go into the cane field, and we would have to go get straw, and it's something, one of the bush was called Medina. I don't know what it's called in the United States, but it's called Medina there. And it was sort of a treat for the horses. And we also went to get cut grass and bring it back to the stable for the horses. Now, one of the things that when we came to the United States, my brother and I, Michael in particular, we would see all these wonderful TV shows where the horses are nice and gentle and friendly, and we would look at each other, and we just had a completely different story, because these were race horses that we were my uncle had. And so we remember how aggressive that they were. We remember how aggressive these horses were. That these horses would kick a hole in the concrete block if they were excited. They would also, chew on the base of the cage that they were in, the stable that they were in. I remember the horses biting a couple of my uncle, and taking a chunk out and biting one of the apprentice there. So the idea of this nice, wonderful horse that they talk about in the United States, that was some kind of horse, because we don't remember those horses. We remember that these horses were much more aggressive in their demeanor. My uncle, because he was so famous, he also knew a lot of politicians. He was sort of one of the celebrities in Jamaica, and at that time you could really use his name if as a way to open some doors. He knew the prime minister. He knew a lot of. They would get him involved during the political season, etc. It was quite interesting how well known he was. Just a sidebar note. I remember. And by the way, my uncle, even though he was, very short guy, he couldn't have been over 5 feet tall. Jockeys are typically very short, and he was very short. This guy had no fear at all. And I remember that he had a machete that he actually sharpened on both sides of the machete, sort of like a sword. And people knew not to mess with Shuffler, because Shuffler was not a guy you wanted to mess with. And so at the time, I remember that my Uncle Clive, when he was beating on us and he started beating Auntie Barbara, I remember that Auntie Barbara was very hesitant to call up, Sammy or her brother, Shuffler, because she knew it was not going to end well, that he would show up with a bunch of his boys, basically, and it would have gotten ugly. And so when my uncle started beating on my aunt, eventually she called him. She picked up the phone and she called, and my Uncle Sammy showed up, and we were like, oh my God, this is not going to be good. I was not there for that, but what I was told is that for all the politeness of my uncle being proper, my Uncle Sammy basically told him very graphically, we come out of the same body part, and if you mess with her, if you fuck with her, he's what he was gonna do to my uncle. And sort of, I think my uncle kind of gulped, because he knew, which is the thing about people who are abusive. They're only abusive when he was beating on children and beating on women, but when it comes to a real man, all of a sudden, you realize he's a fucking coward. And so my uncle told him that, look, if you ever do that again, then it's not going to end well for you. And I think shortly after that, I think my aunt decided to move before it actually got uglier, because I guess she probably was avoiding, something, really terrible happening. On a sidebar note, I also remember my aunt going to church. My aunt came from a family where my grandmother was very big in the church. And so she was a pillar of the community and a matriarch in the church, and she was sort of, like I said, the glue that held the family together up at Rock Hall. And my Aunt Barbara and several of her siblings continued to go to church. And I remember at the time, Auntie Barbara would always go to church, and especially sometime during the week, sometime on Sundays. And I remember that we would sit in the church forever. Like, we were in church for like hours, like all day, like 8 hours plus in church. And I used to think, I'm like, how much is enough church? Didn't God talk to you already? I mean, for 8 hours you're there, and it was just long days. And sometimes they'd feed us, but it was scant food at the time there. It was just not a fun memory I remember of that time. But I remember this guy that showed up in Jamaica, and for the sake of legal purposes, I'll not mention his name, but I do remember him showing up, and he was a big shot from the United States, and he had a PhD, and he was this well-known bishop that came from the United States, and he was supposed to be healing people. And I remember him showing up, and actually, one of the first things I remember is him, asking for collection to build a church in Jamaica. And I remember he had people in the church, volunteer and making promises, for, how much money they were going to donate to the church. And I remember Auntie Barbara actually, promising $800 at the time, which is the total amount of her paycheck that she got paid for the month, because teachers got paid monthly. And I remember that this guy, she gave the money to the church, and I just couldn't understand, why would somebody give all of their money, every dime that they made, to the church? But you know, that's my Aunt Barbara really was a very religious woman, and she continued to remain very religious. And I remember that we went to, and Barbara was very, very excited, and she was like, oh, we're gonna go see the Reverend, and he's having this big, you know, missionary or whatever, I can't remember the term, revival, I think it was. And when they got there, she says, oh, there's gonna be a lot of healing that's gonna happen, a lot of healing that was gonna happen at the time. And I remember there were people on the stage with all sort of ailments. And, you know, he'd put his hand on them and he'd pray for them, and all of a sudden they're healed and people would get up out of their chairs. And I remember back then I was skeptical. I was like, you know, they're like, oh, the person got up out of the chair. And I was thinking, I didn't really see them get up out of the chair. So I was skeptical, and then they would tell me, oh, somebody was blind and they could see. And I remember being so skeptical about that guy because I didn't see the evidence at the time, and as a kid, you know, you wanted to be up close and personal to see it. And I just, you know, it's kind of interesting how a child sees the world. And I remember years later when I came to the United States that a lot of those guys were exposed for making claims that they were healing people and it was all fake.
Step right up, folks. Here's the answer to your problems. Dr. Utopia's sensational new discovery, EZIE. EZIE will cure any ailment of the body politic. It's terrific. It's tremendous. Once you swallow the contents of this bottle, you'll have the bountiful benefit of higher wages, shorter hours, and security. Enormous profits, no strikes. Remember, you're the big boss. Government control, no worry about votes. Name your own salary. Bigger crops, lower cost. Why, EZIE even makes the weather perfect every day. And now then, because we are introducing this amazing item for the first time in this country, it isn't going to cost you 1 cent. All you have to do is sign this little scrap of paper, and you get your bottle absolutely free.
I hereby turn over to EZIE Incorporated everything I have, including my freedom and the freedom of my children and my children's children, in return for which said EZIE promises to take care of me forever.
And so that's the memory that I have of that timeline there in Jamaica. I just thought I'd share it with you. Thank you for listening to the podcast. As I said before in my last podcast, if you have a story you'd like to share, please write to me. And if it's interesting enough, I'll actually maybe read it on the air on my podcast for you. Please make sure it's brief. It's not very, very long because I can't read a book on air. But if it's, you know, a short story that you can share with me about your experience, I'd be happy to consider reading it. Take care, and thanks for watching.